All right, so here we are, still continuing on with chapter 24. So we've talked about, again, the European movement into the Americas. We also talked about kind of the reasons behind that, the encomienda and hacienda systems, the conquering of the Spanish and Portuguese, well, mostly the Spanish taking over, the Incas and the Aztecs, how that kind of happens, resistance movements, the social class system. So now we're moving more into the Portuguese. Well, I'm kind of moving away a little bit from the Spanish, but also we're going to add in the addition of, the Portuguese in Brazil, how that leads to more large numbers of slavery or of people coming over from Africa as slaves, and then kind of how that also looks and comparing it with, the other types of European colonies from the British, from the French, from the Dutch, and then also throwing in the aspects of religion here within this video. So, in terms of sugar plantations, so this is kind of what most of these images are related to in terms of also, slave trade picture down here. So, sugar plantations, as we kind of mentioned in chapter 21 and 22, or chapters 21 and 22, is essentially the fact that, sugar is this really important kind of, resource that people are looking for. All right, and turning sugarcane, which had been done kind of throughout the Mediterranean and the Islamic world, was then taken in by Europeans, and as we said, kind of expanded into kind of the Atlantic, and then brought over to the Americas shortly after Columbus, and that's kind of what the encomienda system is eventually developed for. So that, and as well as the other types of systems as well. So it's a very hard task to convert sugarcane into molasses and then also into just kind of refined sugar that we kind of think about, what we use for baking and things like that. It takes a lot of effort and needs a very large labor force. And so the Portuguese begin this in Brazil, and you kind of think about all the work in here. Here's kind of a few different visual examples here. It's very labor intensive, takes a very long time. And again, talking about mistreatment is you can kind of think about all this stuff related to it. And so again, here's kind of what you do to, get that stuff turning into, again, or refining the actual sugar cane into refined sugar within this stuff. And so again, you can kind of see videos on YouTube related to that as well for what that really looks like, right? So because there's a lot of resistance to the Portuguese in Brazil and the decimated indigenous populations, in order to make this profitable, essentially what they have to do is bring in manual labor, in this case again enslaved labor, as we'll expand upon much more when we get to chapter 25 and the actual talking about the Atlantic slave trade. We're going to briefly mention things here. Use of African slaves, and then the other Europeans will join in. And so the Portuguese and the Spanish start seeing, we need people to get here, and we can't convince Portuguese and Spanish people to come. Not at least in large numbers to work manual labor jobs. And so that's why they turn to these indigenous peoples and then to Africans, because they just can't convince people to give up their lives in the New World and make them essentially manual laborers. And so that's why they do it. They can get people over here to be overseers, to be landowners, to be investors, but not do the actual manual labor that needs to be done in order to process, the actual crops into other things that they could then sell, or for the mining jobs. That's where they struggle. So they get about 500,000 total Portuguese and Spanish people that move into the Americas, over the next couple hundred years. But again, that's a very small margin, essentially, again, to essentially run the societies. So that's, again, kind of the European take for what they're trying to do. In terms of how damaging this is, all right, about how many people actually ended up dying, about 5 to 10% of all slaves died annually in terms of the actual moving of them across the ocean, as well as the manual labor that they're doing. That means that there is a large demand for an increased number of slaves because we're trying to produce more and more of these crops. We need more and more slaves because, we're trying to expand production, but also a very large number or very large percentage is dying every single year. Also play that into the fact that to kind of offset again those numbers, they're predominantly looking for males. They're not looking for females to help repopulate, so they're constantly needing and demanding more males get captured to offset this. Not females to help grow the population, but to continually bring in more because so many of them are dying. And it comes out to a ratio of about every single slave equals about 1 ton, or so about 2,000 pounds of sugar in terms of their cost, labor, and profit. About one slave is going to die for every 2,000 pounds. So that tells you kind of the worth of how much this all comes out to. It's very, very, as the book kind of points out, very slim profit margins for the people even producing this stuff, and that's also going to help offset why the Portuguese and the Spanish actually end up losing in their investments later on in a couple hundred years once sugar doesn't take on as much of an importance in terms of that. But this is again what kind of sets up these scenarios within the Americas, because sugar for a couple hundred years is kind of that big crop, that cash crop that the Europeans are trying to make a lot of money on to raise their funding that they could then use for manufacturing, for other products, for increased trade, investment, to make more and more money. All right, so the British, French, and Dutch will begin to make their own plantations in the Caribbean for increased profits, also using slaves, because again, they're not able to convince people to work manual labor like this as a result. The Portuguese in the late 1600s would then find gold, predominantly on the interior parts of Brazil. That again increases the demand for slaves, and then again support for other industries. Much like we said, if you're going to start up a mining town, or a mining camp, you're going to need people that again produce food, clothing, medical care, other types of investment, things like that. But as we're going to end up seeing, Portugal and many other countries and European powers will become reliant on England for manufactured goods to run their colonies. So again, essentially, all the manufactured stuff is going to come from other parts of Europe that are investing in other areas. All right. So while the French and the Dutch aren't going to necessarily bring in a whole lot of people into North America itself, they all bring them into the Caribbean. You can kind of see here's kind of that flow chart of what's going on within the Atlantic slave trade. The vast majority end up in Brazil and then into the Caribbean, and then a very small number, at least as a percentage, ends up in the United States and Canada. Now, mind you, those are still large numbers in total, but it's a small percentage of the actual number of people brought over because of, again, the large demand, the number of high deaths, as well as the difference in how the colonies are being developed inside of the New World. So as we'll expand upon this again in chapter 25. So the African slave trade, the Europeans will use tribal rivalries or rival tribes to get Africans to essentially enslave each other in return for guns, other manufactured products, and essentially offsetting the balance of power within the region or throughout much of Africa for this demand of over 10 million slaves within West Africa. So you're pulling about 10 million people out of the population, mainly taken from the western coastline, again, going from, Mali on down through Angola, and even a little bit into South Africa, and then pulling them from there. Hence why you see, again, this flow chart of, where the vast majority are being drawn from, a lot of it being drawn, again, from the areas from sub-Saharan Africa, brought over that way. All right. So they're going to play off on those, and we'll expand upon that and kind of the impacts, the more investments behind that, what that's really going to look like, and again, turning Africans against other Africans, all right, or increasing Africans against other Africans. So here, unfortunately, you see a slave ship within the Middle Passage. Kind of, again, the reasons why so many of them are dying is, again, essentially being chained up, malnourished, lack of medical care. Those get better, but again, it's not great situations for anybody involved, all right. So comparing the actual different colonies, so the Dutch formed their colonies in North America for cash crop trading, first to bring Africans, and they're the first ones to bring it to North America beyond the Caribbean, not focusing on too many large settlements. So again, predominantly for fur trading and for cash crops. So again, New York is one place they settle, so you can kind of see all that here. New Amsterdam, which becomes New York City, was one of them. And so again, their impact in terms of all that is very limited, and then gets eventually taken over by the British. All right. So New France, having predominantly Canada and through the area of what we now know to essentially be the Louisiana Purchase, the Ohio River Valley, is essentially claimed by the French. And what they do, however, is very different in terms of their connections with the indigenous populations here in the Americas. They're doing it for the fur trade, which again, there'll be another video on that, and the silver trade. They make a lot of close connections with and essentially assimilate into indigenous cultures within, where you kind of see these different French forts, even here in the United States or even in Minnesota, and also, again, Canada, Quebec, other locations, to, again, increase their percentage of the fur trade, which allows them, the Métis, what they're called, essentially become part of the indigenous cultures, a lot of close cultural ties, a lot of them intermarry, take on the indigenous languages or take part in that to increase their percentage of the trade. And so then they began to have, intermarried families. And it actually worked out pretty well for the French. They were, again, having those close relationships, those close ties. And again, there is the offset of, the European diseases that kill off people. But for the most part, they are assimilating. They're not trying to conquer. They are trying to make these close bonds and ties to increase their trade, which for France for a long time actually works pretty well. All right. And then we got, the British colonies, which again, that's where a lot of that stuff is in terms of the United States within the first unit of U.S. history. So we've kind of done that. So I'm just kind of, so the big thing here, we got a lot of people moving into the English colonies for a variety of different reasons. You think about, the Puritans for religious freedom. They were looking just to actually just practice their own type of religion away from everybody else because they thought everyone else was doing it wrong. But you have other people moving in as well, predominantly, again, in the southern states, which was indentured servitude, where unlike slavery, where you're essentially in there your whole life, indentured servitude, you come to the Americas with no money, you're going to work the land for a number of years, and then once your length of service is up, whatever, like 3, 5, 7, 10 years, whatever, once that length of service is done, you are free to do whatever you want. You're typically given some land, some clothing, some money, and then you're free to go off and invest, create your own stuff. Now, a number of people don't survive indentured servitude, but that was a big draw for people to come on over to the Americas because most people in England, if you were, the second or third son, you didn't have any say in the inheritance. You weren't going to get anything. So in order to essentially be a British citizen, you had to own property. And so this was essentially a connection to, I'm going to move over to these British colonies or the English colonies, and I'm going to, work for a number of years, and then I'm going to be a free person. I'll be able to own land and I'll be able to have rights. I'll be able to make my own way in the world rather than, working or living off of my brother. So that's a big draw for a lot of people, again, for that movement. But also, again, the other issues of, religious toleration, land ownership, more merchant stuff, things like that. So the last thing we're going to hit on here is the idea of Christianity. So what is that actually playing into? We've mentioned it a bit here. So a lot of the Spanish Christian, so specifically Catholic missionaries, attempt to convert the indigenous peoples from the start. And again, as we've looked at a lot of the documents, that was supported by European monarchs, the Pope, other religious leaders, and will syncretize with local beliefs to get more people involved. So again, they start off with, the chiefs, their families, and then try to hope to spread it to the more local people. Hopefully that sounds familiar about how they were able to spread religion in other areas. All right. And again, hopefully a lot of these other things should sound a bit familiar. Missionaries founding schools, educating the local leaders and the noble children, but also integrating and learning the languages better to communicate and spread the gospel. So oftentimes you find the Christian missionaries writing the histories, writing down the customs and the beliefs of the indigenous peoples to get closer to them in order to better have a chance at successfully converting them. Initially, there's a really low success of this, as they would, practice their own original faith away from the Christians, being like, yeah, we'll play along with you, and then we'll go off to the woods, or we'll go off to the mountains, and we'll practice our own faith, and you won't have any idea. But over time, as a result of religious education, connection to their own history, again, this plays in with the Aztecs, thinking that the Europeans, in a sense, there's the idea that Cortez was supposed to be the return of one of their gods, but also the syncretizing of and the worship of the views of the saints with their own deities. We kind of mentioned this in the previous video with the Virgin of Guadalupe being essentially the Virgin Mary appearing to mestizos, converts a lot of people or attracts a lot of people. So this is kind of that symbol of that syncretism within the idea of Mexican Catholicism about what draws these people in. So there's a variety of things that bring in and convert more people to Christianity within the Spanish missions. To do that. That's kind of one thing that the Spanish were trying to do within the encomiendas was to, again, spread the gospel. And then when we talk about chapter 23, we're talking about Europe and the religious divisions, this is going to have more of an impact for why they're trying to do that and to get more Catholic followers. All right. The French and the English, while they bring Christianity with them, they don't actually try to convert a whole lot of people. If they did try and convert them, they didn't necessarily try and integrate them into regular society. And then with slavery and religion, as we'll again talk about with chapter 25, forcing that on the African enslaved population. So here's kind of that stuff with, the thing of the Virgin of Guadalupe within Mary. Again, our Mexican representation of her. Triangular trade we'll mention later on. Last thing I want to hit on, was the colonies essentially eventually becoming self-reliant with the exception of manufactured goods, which we'll play in again later on.